So this is Dan Royles, representing the Miami AIDS Memorials Project and the Knowledge of AIDS scholarly group. And I'm interviewing Jennie Brier for our scholar interview series. Jennie, do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Jennie Brier. I'm a historian. I'm on the faculty at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And for the last long time, I think it might be 30 years, I've been writing about the history of HIV. I, that is just a astounding thing to say out loud.
And how did you come to work on the history of HIV? How did you get to to the set of topics?
Well, a lot of different ways, as is the case with most people. I grew up in the East Village of New York City in the 70s and 80s. And my family knew people who died from complications related to AIDS. I think the first person we knew died in 1983, a man named Kevin Majors. And people on my block, uh, for the most part, Black and Puerto Rican men, um, who were caught up in various survival economies, also died of complications related to AIDS. It was the East Village of a different time. The East Village of the early 80s was really different than it is today. I think that really influenced me. And coming out in the early 90s, in that moment, also leaving New York before, just as ACT UP was starting, um, and going to Wisconsin for college, just had a really different configuration of activism and thinking about scholarship. But once I got to graduate school and started to think about a dissertation topic, it just became more and more like the thing that I was going to do. I had no idea that I was going to spend 30 years doing it. At different points, I've wanted to stop because it's too much. Um, and I think that has for me kind of changed the way I approach it. So, writing my dissertation and then the book Infectious Ideas, I was really like scholar historian, like in the archive, in the historical record. And I think after that, and the project that I've been working on for the last 10 years on the living women's history of HIV that we're going to talk about, I've really centered living people. And that's been a way for me to hook back in and be in that space. And, you know, a way of, I think there's like a constant process of sort of tricking myself into continuing. Like, for a long time, I was pretty convinced that because I was working on a living women's history, that no one would die. And of course, that's not true. So some of those women have passed away. That was like cognitively just hard to understand how they were in this group. So how could they not be alive anymore? And that was how I felt in some ways when I was writing Infectious Ideas. Like I just couldn't hold the fact that I was writing about people who were gone before they were supposed to be. So I don't know, that's a kind of one way to answer the question, I guess.
So, can you tell me about how you came to work specifically on I'm Still Surviving, the Living Women's History of HIV?
Yeah. Um, well, after Infectious Ideas came out, I went back to really working in public history, which is where I had been before I went to graduate school. Um, I had interned for a year and then worked for a year at the National Museum of American History in the Smithsonian in DC. And then I went to graduate school because I realized in part that really I wanted to be a curator or a historian. And, there's a complicated sort of class politics to the work of public history. So um, off I went. And then I sort of, as I said, put that down to be this academic historian. And then I got reconnected to public history and I curated this exhibition called Out in Chicago at the Chicago History Museum. And that was a really amazing experience for me. And then out of that, I then really started to think about what it would mean to be a practicing public historian in addition to being a historian, academic historian. Um, and I created this entity, this public history project called History Moves, which was about putting the public at the center of public history. And I thought that that was all going to be a way for me to sort of make a break from AIDS. But it turns out that that's not what it is. So, um, we'd done a bunch of different projects, a couple different projects with the History Moves work. We made a prototype of a traveling exhibition space, like part of a shipping container that we talked about ways of engaging with various public entities to do history. And then I met in person a woman who I had known by name and by connection, named Marge Cohen. Marge Cohen is a internist who had been at Cook County, now Stroger Hospital, but then Cook County, and been part of the sort of radical internist, the house, the union of doctors. I mean, just an amazing kind of activist. And she started in 1988, 89, the Women and Children's Clinic, Women and Children with AIDS Clinic at Cook County. And we met at a social thing, and I said, "Oh, I'm doing this project called History Moves about public history for pe ordinary people, like how they think about history and their own histories and blah, blah." And she said, "Oh, the WISE, the Women's Interagency HIV study that she was one of the first co-PIs for. So there's a site in Chicago, one in Brooklyn, one in the Bronx, LA, San Francisco, maybe DC. I can't remember where the other original one is." And she said, "We're celebrating our 20th anniversary." This was in 2014. And I was like, "Oh, okay." Because that it started in 94. And I was like, "Oh, well, why don't I just walk down the street? Because it's literally down the block from UIC on the same street." And I was like, "Why don't I come meet some of the women and we'll talk and see what we can cook up?" And she was like, "Okay." And so we walk, I mean, we drove. It's probably a 20-minute walk. It was hot. I don't know what it was. Anyway, it was November, I think. And they had assembled all of these women. There were probably like 15 or 20 of them, and they had a big table in the back of the clinic. And um, and we had worked with a graphic designer named Matt Wazinski, and we had thought about different ways of engaging with people about how to make history, how to make public history. Obviously, all people make history. And we knew that we wanted to work in oral history, which is what I am good at, and he works in visual history. So we sort of knew that we were talking about the intersection of material culture and oral history. And he's able to to visualize things in a way that I exist in my mind in a very different way. And I remember we were sitting around the table and we were starting to talk about what they would want, these sort of extraordinary women So this is 2014. The majority of these women have been in the study who are sitting at that table since 94, which means that they have come every year for twice a year, done blood draws, pap smears, um, answered really intense questions, and some of them have never missed a visit. So we're talking about just people who are used to being researched. And we're talking about, and a lot of them had been positive since the 80s. So we start talking and we're sort of, I say to them, does anybody have anything, any object that you think about that you associate with being positive? And they'd all talked about, they sort of go, first they went around the room and introduced themselves, and they introduced themselves by name, but also by how they think they seroconverted. Like that's part of their introduction. And a lot of them know each other, but they also don't. Like they're numbers in this. They're not people, and so they may have seen each other, and some of them don't know each other, or they know each other, but they don't know each other's names or whatever it is. And and then I was like, okay, well, that was an amazing experience to sort of listen to. And then um, I said, do you have any objects that you think of? And literally four of them, five of them went into their wallets and pulled out these orange cards that are their Cook County cards. And it was really just incredible. They're bright orange. And that then became a way for us to think about that was the beginning really of the project, was that deep introduction that they made to us and to one another, and then those orange cards. And they were like, oh, we would really like an exhibition to be in the Walgreens. We want people to know that we're still alive. And they were very focused on talking to younger people about about HIV. Um, so that's how it started. And then, from there it just became something much bigger than that. But that was the start.
Can you talk a little bit about how the project works in terms of interviewing? Because I know you have um, the women interviewing each other, which is pretty unique to this project. So could you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
How we did that. Yeah, um, I don't even remember how that all, I mean, that was definitely we brought that with us to the project. Like History Moves had that in it before the living history, before I'm Still Surviving. I think for me, I'd been talking a lot with um oh, what is his name? The guy who does the history of homelessness at American. Uh, I'll have to remember his name. You'll have to put it in when we find it. Um, it's not Ted Kerr because Ted Kerr is our Ted Kerr, but it's Dan Kerr. Oh, God. See, it's just a combination. Dan Kerr. Um, we had been talking about oral history work. He had done this really amazing oral history work with people experiencing homelessness. I was always struck that I felt like oral histories where historians were the interviewers were really different than I guess I wanted something different than that. I wanted to see something different. And I had a hunch that participating in oral history, both as an interviewer and a narrator, was something important. Maybe I'd done StoryCorps with my partner, and there had been this weird moment where I was doing the interviewing and she was talking, and the person who was there to be the recorder sort of asked a question, and I was like, no, no, that's not the question I'm asking. And I that there was that moment where I was like, this is not actually, this is something that people can do. And the experience of doing it, having both sides of it seemed important. I don't remember the other reasons why we did it, but it worked, so we just kept doing it. And that's in essence what we do. And so we did in Chicago, we did it much more like scattershot because we could come whenever we wanted. We could convene people, we could set things up. When we got funding from MAC AIDS Fund to do the work in North Carolina and Brooklyn, we had to get much tighter in the way we did it. So we really developed these workshops, these 2-day workshops where we sort of went through deep introductions. We talked about oral history, about listening, about getting people off their scripts, about, all of those things. And then we would generate questions that people could ask one another that were, focused on HIV, but also not focused on people's lives beyond HIV. And then some of the women would read the script, ask the question, and then they would answer. And some of the women just like went to town, like they just got it completely. They got it. And so, but in all of the cases, um, because women had both experiences, I think it was um, that was powerful. And then we also figured out that there was a way to um, take the interview transcripts and the photographs. And Matt actually figured this out for Brooklyn. We had done it in as I said, a scattershot way in Chicago. What happened in Chicago was we took the quotes that we liked and we put them onto Excel sheets and then we asked them to read them and check them. And they were like, "Oh, isn't that my quote?" Or that, "Oh, that's your quote. I thought that was my quote." But then they started to see the connection. So what we figured out was we would ask them to choose. We transcribed the interviews and then we shared those interviews back and we asked them to choose the parts that they really wanted to share, the parts that they didn't want to share, and the parts that they were agnostic about. And then we made these contact sheets with the quotes on them. So they were these huge sheets of paper that were there. Like we made them a copy to keep, and then we cut them up into like little decks of cards and they could put them up on the wall with one another. So there are these great pictures of Brooklyn women all working on these huge sheets that are on the wall, putting their quotes up into different areas. And then they would meet each other like at a picture that we had put up. And one would be like, "That was my corner." And the other one was like, "No, that was my corner." They would do that. And that was pretty incredible. But making those contact sheets. So it was really like because the priority of the project was first and foremost for them. And then it became this other thing also. But the books that we made were for them. And then the everything else was for other people, but they were the first audience, them, the women themselves. So it was like, how do you do that?
It- Are there specific ways that you can think of that we haven't talked about already that like that question of audience shaped the project in important ways or led you to different processes or outcomes? Like, having the women be the audience versus having some larger public be the audience.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't mm, I do think it's a really important distinction. And sometimes I mean, I think most of the time we held true to that. And then some of the times when people would say, like, "This is so amazing, we want to be able to, like, then you sort of like veer off. And that's, you know, I think that the women are really pleased. I know that the women are really pleased, and feel seen in a way that they wouldn't have ever felt, they hadn't ever felt seen before. Um, it's hard because public history is for publics, and a memorial project is for publics, but external to it. But I think that in the case of doing something where people are still living, they kind of have to be first, and it does mean that it sometimes changes what happens beyond them. You know, meaning like you might, if they weren't part of it, it might be something different. But you know, like, so here's the example I'll give you. Um, Matt had his design class work on the first exhibition that was just about Chicago. And we had a budget, $5,000, and it was like, that's what you have. And the students, they're design students, you know, they're like trying all these things. I remember it was long before, I mean, it was 2014, 2015. So we were like using this thing called WebEx that no one had used before. We like, because they were in Cincinnati and the women obviously were in Chicago. And I remember I went to the Y's in the medical district in Chicago, and there was a bunch of women around the table, all women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, some of them. Um, and the students were presenting these ideas for like how you would get people to the exhibition. And some of them had, one of the teams, you know, had some idea that you would like put up mannequins, like those little skinny mannequins that are white, and like direct people. I don't know, it's like some weird design thing. And the women were like, no, that's not gonna work. That's not what our bodies look like. I mean, we would have never done that, but it was still like that moment where like they are the clients. That's the reality, is that we aren't the clients of the design students. The women are the clients of the design students. And the women are our clients. We're designing something for them first and for other audiences second. So it's hard because, you know, that's not singularly, there's not a singular audience even with those living women. But they are your, but maybe it's that, maybe that's the distinction, is that they're the clients, not the audience.
Um, could you talk about some aspect of the project, something about the project that you really love, that you're really proud of?
Well, um, I have a relationship with at least a dozen women still. So there were 39 women who were in the project, I think. Probably six of them have passed. I'm still connected to about a dozen women in somewhat regular contact. And I say that because I think so much of what I think is not wrong with public history, but what I want people to know is that the like one of the most lasting things of this work is the relationships that are built. And that I'm really proud of. I'm really proud of that. Um, and I would say, externally speaking, um, I am very proud of how many students have been involved in the project over its lifetime, and how Matt and I have been able to, they've all like, they've learned something pretty significant from the project. Um, and then, of course, the largest um, or the most historically significant is that women are important in the history of HIV, which I don't think people often really think about. And I would argue that women, potentially women are the among the most important category of people um, for shaping what we understand HIV/AIDS to be today, but they are at the start of PrEP. PrEP is only possible because of women. PEP, uh, um, what it means to have AIDS as opposed to be HIV positive, what it means to think about uh, care for people living with HIV as being more than medication. All of those things come not exclusively from women, but importantly in critical ways from women. So it's all of those things, I guess. Those are three things. I know I was only allowed one, but I went backwards.
You can have as many as you want. I think
Okay,
there's a
well, now
lot.
I'll take those three.
There's so much to be proud about with this project. Like you're not limited in the length of your list there. Uh, uh, yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about your projects, I feel like, with other people as like, here's a model of somebody doing something really, really important and cool and a little bit out of the box for the reasons that you mentioned. And so I think it's a really admirable project. I know you talked about, some of the women have passed since you started I'm Still Surviving. And I want to talk a little bit about challenges that have come up with this project. So I don't know if you want to talk more about that, or if there's other challenges that are worth mentioning here.
Yeah. I mean, there are a bunch of challenges. The how to deal with stigma writ large. So that's a challenge. And that comes in lots of different forms in this project and obviously in any project related to HIV. Um, so some of the women are completely insistent that they have to be known by their full name. I was here. This is who I am. I am not a number. I am not an initial. I am this person. And some of the women don't want to be anything but an initial or a pseudonym. And some of the women have been in other projects about HIV, the women's history, not the women's history, but women's experience with HIV and have been pseudonyms. And so it's like they know what that's like. And then it's interesting sometimes, I mean, I've obviously talked with Celeste Watkins Hayes, whose book about Black women and HIV. I mean, we've talked about we know who is who. Um, and the women do too, obviously. Uh, but there is something about that challenge. And there's an assumption, I think, from a lot of social science and health researchers who believe in who function on anonymity, right? They even change the name of a city. You won't even know what city people are talking about, and history. And those are they're very different approaches. And I think that is a challenge that it's a critical challenge that has a lot of implications. Um, how do you maintain someone's anonymity if you have their voice? And now, even more so with what's happening with AI. I mean, I am nervous about that part. We're about to try and post some things to JSTOR, and I'm worried about that. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I don't, And then there's the other piece. One of the women said to me, this is the only time in our lives that we've got to be the researchers. These are our stories, and they're the thing that we have that have value. So there's that, like obviously, um, we arrange to pay for people when they enter, but it's not valued correctly, you know. Um, but I have really made a commitment to any money that I get as honoraria for anything related to this. I just send it out to people. I don't keep it. But that seems like little comfort in the scheme of things. Um, so there's that challenge. Um, the challenge of getting back to getting of us, our timeline not matching their timeline. And that comes in lots of different directions. You can imagine what that means. Like it took us a while to get the books to North Carolina and Brooklyn, in part because of the pandemic, but in part because Matt and I have complicated lives and it's hard to do, but that is part of what has to happen in maintaining a relationship. Um, And then the other challenge that we faced is that, we decided to do, we couldn't, the more academic challenge is that we tried to sort of pitch the idea of giving the books to some press that could help us publish them, and no one would do it. They were like, we can't publish this book. It'd be too expensive. So we did it with Blurb, and we're going to continue to do it with Blurb until the JSTOR comes out, and then we will take the Blurb book down. So we're trying to get it into some libraries right now. It has a ISBN number, so it's possible. Um, and yeah, I mean, then there's like the challenges with the women. Like people have talked about incredibly painful experiences. And um, holding those is complicated. Collecting them was complicated. But I feel like, I want the interviews are they belong to the women. That's the other challenging part is like if you go to a library, it's like they want to take ownership of them. And I'm like, no, they're not yours. They're theirs. They're just letting us look at them. So that's a challenge of how the academy treats these materials. Um, I don't know, there's probably more, but that sounds good.
What, in your experience, has being part of this project been like for the women? What kind of effect on them have you seen? How have you seen them respond to it? What do you think for them the impact is?
Um, Everyone that I've continued to stay in touch with has basically expressed some version of you know, this is an incredible experience. This was an incredible experience for us. And it's easier for me, obviously, to maintain a relationship with the women in Chicago because I've lived through new grandchildren being born. I get regular updates. We have lunch or things like that. Um, and that has, I wish I had that with all of the women, and perhaps that's a problem with doing a project where you're not proximate to the people, because it's hard to maintain. I have text relationships with the women outside of Chicago, but that's not quite the same. So, but they all, we did a book party in Brooklyn and all of the women were there. And I've gone back. I went to the 30th anniversary celebration in Brooklyn, and I saw a bunch of the women there. And, you know, from the there's one exchange between two women in Brooklyn um, that I will, remember forever. I was interviewing, so we would set up these times where there would be three of us. And the one woman was one of the like the OGs. You know, they were both in the first class, but this woman was like old, like she was OG, Jeanette. She is just this amazing force of nature. And Sherry hadn't shown up. And we started and we were talking and talking and talking, and we decided to, and then Sherry just showed up like an hour and a half late. And we kind of readjusted and and it was really clear that Sherry had been in a not good place. And at one point, she sort of starts to take over the interview of Jeanette, or maybe Jeanette was interviewing Sherry. I can't remember what it was. And Sherry's alarm on her phone goes off, and she's like, "Oh yeah, whatever." It was when she was supposed to take meds, and she was like, I'm not doing that." And Jeanette, like, she went into like full on, like, you have to take care of yourself. Like, this is what we have to do for one another. Like, they had this whole exchange. And to this day, I mean, I just saw Sherry in Brooklyn earlier, um, like in October. Like, she talks about that day, that moment, you know? Um, Women who had never told another soul other than their doctor that they were positive. So, I mean, at a very fundamental level, like what it means to say these are about the women, it's true. Like that's the part that is what it is, and the rest of it is what we get to learn and feel and understand from it, but that's the first priority.
Kind of pulling back from just this project, or using this project as the example.
Hmm.
Um, what do you think? What should we understand from this project about the issue of AIDS and memory more broadly? What does this project tell us that's really important in that kind of larger conversation?
It's such a great question. Um, I mean, I think the first thing is that I think the decision to call it a living women's history matters. I think often memorials feel like they're about the dead, and this is in some ways about the dead, but it's also about the living. So I think that's one piece. Um, I think the other piece I mean, that I sort of alluded to at the start of the interview is that for me, in being a historian of AIDS, looked one way for me, this sort of like rooted in the archive, um, rooted in the written record, rooted in the analysis of legal and policy documents and legislative debates and blah, 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 blah. Um, and but when you center people living with HIV, it changes how you think about what HIV means. And I know that we say all the time, and we know even the term people with AIDS or people living with HIV comes out of an activist tradition of saying we are not victims, we are not patients, we are people. But centering those lived experiences in the way we memorialize, in this case, HIV, but frankly, if centering people with lived experience in the way we memorialize anything changes what it means to memorialize it. Because it's a way of seeing people who have died in a different through a different valence. It also allows us to see what survival means, So the three books have they're three different titles. The one for Chicago is called I'm Still Surviving, and that's the name of the whole project. But the book on Brooklyn is called I'm a Challenger. One of the women talked about that. And the other, I'm a Warrior. Um, and what I just think what it means to really center these women's voices and their experiences in the way we understand something that we are now, you know, in the fifth decade of. And also, we still have these, I think, incorrect or inaccurate tropes like the new face of AIDS or whatever it is, like women have been at the start of this, period, point blank. So there is nothing new here. Um, and yeah, I mean, I guess I actually would wonder what you see. I mean, I'm curious, like, what do you see? And it's hard to know, like I've taught it some. I've gone to classes where I've seen it taught. We created this teaching section for the website to suggest lesson plans for people. But yeah, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, you certainly have a deep experience with related topics.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that draws me to this project always is the idea of having the women interview each other
Yeah,
because, we often talk about oral history as a way of democratizing the archive, and it can be that, but obviously there's still a power relationship in
yeah,
being an interviewer and being the one who frames questions you know, in so many ways, even as we try to cut against that position, or we may try to cut against that position, we're still in a lot of ways in the driver's seat when we're doing interviewing. All the best practices in oral history notwithstanding, in a lot of ways that remains the case. So I love the idea of having the women interview each other because it devolves the power of being the interviewer to the two people whose stories are being told, right? The participatory aspect of it, I think is just so cool. I love what you just said about putting living people at the center of the story because that is something to grapple with in commemoration or memorialization for a variety of reasons. One, so that people understand that as activists have been saying since 1988, AIDS is not over. And when we build something that is named a memorial to the epidemic, that locates it in the past, right? Like that's what memorials often do is say, these are things that belong to the past. They are the subject now of memory as opposed to our experience in the here and now. Um, so I think that's a really important point for everyone to take forward. So you've given us like kind of a framework for kind of thinking or talking about that, and then maybe a model of how to um, how to do that in practice, or
hmm
some ideas for thinking about how to do that in practice, to put living
Miami
people at
is
the
such a,
center. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, Miami is such an interesting place for the women's history of HIV. Also, just thinking about Miami as a site, I think is a really important part of what I'm excited that to see you all do with this project. Um, yeah, and not easy.
Could you talk a little bit about what makes it so exciting to you from the perspective of women's
The
history
women's history.
events?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I interviewed after this project. I've interviewed a few of the people involved in the first pediatric um, AIDS studies, and there's a PD demo site in Miami, um, and you know, it's pretty clear that there are obviously pediatric cases of what we would now call HIV um, in Miami in the very much in the early 80s. And um, it's, I think it's a story that will explain Miami as part of the Caribbean, like understanding the relationship between Haiti and Puerto Rico and Miami and other parts of the Caribbean basin. I think it will help us understand how migration matters to the history of HIV. Um, I think uh, I think it will be a place perhaps to find people who were children who were infected perinatally. I think some of them will still be alive. I think that'll be an interesting thing to talk about, to sort of rewrite how we understand children with HIV. Um, so I think that'll be an important piece of this. Um, and then there's all of the stuff about that I don't really know much about, but you and Julio clearly do, and Dudley also, about the kind of racial politics, sexual politics of Miami, um, and just being another site where you see that attention to white gay men is just I mean, it's a scrim that doesn't hold up, you know? If you look in any of these places like Miami or the Bronx or Newark or um, LA or DC for that matter, from that early period.
Looking ahead, how do you see this project going forward? How do you see it evolving? How do you see it living on? How do you want it to be itself remembered, um, or used or by scholars or, whatever you have kind of imagined as the afterlife of it?
Yeah. It's a huge question. You know, we have we're working on this JSTOR connection for the Reveal Digital, that AIDS and art collection. It's hard. The metadata part is hard. I've had to reconsent all of the living women, which has taken an extraordinary amount of time, partially because it's hard to do, and partially because it's just, I want to have a connection. I want to speak to all of them. It's hard. Like, I can't do that. It's difficult. Um, and explain to them what JSTOR means is also hard because the website is great. Maybe it'll be viewed, maybe it's been viewed 5,000 times. I mean, we're talking about an order of magnitude different with JSTOR. I am also, as I said before, I'm thinking a lot about what it means at this moment with AI to have that in the digital universe. Um, I do I do love the pedagogical potential of the project. I love hearing about how people teach it or think about it. And I love getting to experience. I get invited sometimes to when a college class, not a high school class, but when a college class, does the group projects at the end. That's amazing. I would love a way to invite the women to some of those. Takes a little bit more coordination, but it's certainly something that I'm willing to do if people want to do it. And but I do also need to sort of think about like what does it mean to close to end a project? And that I haven't quite figured out yet because the relationships are the part that matter so much to me. Those relationships will continue, but at some point the project, and there's no more work to do on the project. Um, I haven't quite gotten that far yet, but I know it's coming. I know it's coming. Um, and I think about it now, I'm working on this living history of long COVID. And that I guess that is it. It's like when we do public history, it's sort of like it exists in this moment. And then we don't have a plan for the things that come after that. I think that that's the part that is, that's where I, as a human being, need to say, like, those relationships are the things that will matter to me. And so wherever those take me, I mean, it's not about the project, that's about the human connection. And I think, you know, it's hard. It's hard to like, it's a lot to take on, but I do feel like it's what I'm supposed to do. I don't know if it's what other people are supposed to do, but it's what I'm supposed to do for it, or what I want to do for it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think that gets at something that we who study AIDS don't talk about much is the emotional experience of doing really heavy work. Um, we all have different relationships to it, but I can't imagine that for any of us, it's easy. And you being so personally involved or how, that's, the relationships are, this is going to sound inartful, a double-edged sword
Mhm.
because they're we know just generally that relationships sustain us as human beings, right? But like having those relationships also opens you up to hurt when, the women, if they get sick or if they pass, right? Like, um, but I'm not even, from thinking about my experience, I'm not even thinking about that. Just, being in the archive, reading so much about, you know, um, we read and write about people getting sick and dying and also living, but also getting sick and dying and all of the the things that make them vulnerable. um yeah, I don't know, it's more of a thought
Yeah,
than
I
anything.
mean, yeah, I think it's that. I think it's about recognizing that, we're all people living with HIV. Some of us have it in our bodies and some of us have it in the world that we interact in, but that those are different also from each other. Um, yeah, I think there's a lot here that requires attention. I don't know how it changes the design, the physical experience of it. But I do think it matters. And I do think that the commitment to sustaining something over a long period of time and not, like recognizing that things have stages. This project, the Miami AIDS project right now requires an incredible amount of intense work. But like the other side of it, it's still going to require something. Like it still needs to be held in some way. And there's something about, I mean, maybe you have experienced this, you write a book and it's done, like it's out in the world, then there's nothing more that's going to happen with that book. You may give talks and you may think of another book and you may think of whatever revisions you want to make, but that sort of exists outside of you. These kinds of memory projects don't. That's not what they are. Um, by design and also because that's not how it it's not what it actually does. So I think we have to make room in our body minds for that. The practitioners, we need to make space for that. And we also need, I mean, this is the part of history moves that I really, um, I guess one of the parts that really matters to me is that I'm not the only interpreter of the history. All of these people. So the participatory part of doing the interviews is one thing, but it's also that when you connect people together, they are doing a kind of collective interpretation that is not often part of our, right? I mean, we are trained to do interpretation. We train graduate students to do interpretation. Like we don't often think about the historical subjects being the historical interpreters. Um, so
I think that's a really important point for us to sit with. But I want to give you the opportunity before we close out, just to say anything else that you want to say or add anything that you want to add.
yeah, I mean, I'm so excited about this project. I'm really happy for you that this is happening, and I think it. I just think the combination of the three of you, I think, makes a really. I just think it's very. It has a lot of possibilities to it. And I'm excited to hear what other people say in these interviews. And just to sort of reflect on, for me, this opportunity to reflect on 30 years of doing this work is really, one that I mean, it's it's an incredible opportunity for me to be able to sit with that. So, thank you.
You're welcome and thank you.